And buonasera a tutti. Good evening, y'all, and thanks for tuning in to another episode 56 of What's the Scoop. I hope y'all had a wonderful week. Hope everybody has enjoyed the past 7 days within sports, particularly last Sunday's game. Um, Obviously, I did. That was quite an amazing game to watch as a sports fan, much less to say as a Philadelphia Eagles fan. So we're definitely going to be covering a lot of that, going to be talking about that quite a bit, as well as getting into some other events and news around sports. We've got spring training having just kicked off within baseball. We've got the NCAA drawing ever closer to March Madness, and so much more to cover as we get through this next 60 minutes. I'm looking forward to having y'all on and hearing what's going on in y'all's minds in the world of sports. If everybody's got a question, anybody's got something they want to say, about any of these topics or anything else, please just jump in. I'll be looking forward to getting involved and getting involved in conversations with y'all throughout the show and hearing what's on everybody's mind. So thanks again, and looking forward to getting into it. Um, Obviously, I think it's got to be probably the biggest thing that we got to get into is recapping that Super Bowl 59 that we all saw last Sunday night. And if for whatever reason you did miss the game, you missed a very exciting one from at least from my vantage point. Obviously, I'm a little bit slanted, a little bit subjective on that, but it really was. It really was an incredible game to see. It kind of reminded me in terms of just for those who didn't see the full game, the final score does not dictate how the full game. It doesn't accurately capture how the full game transpired. This was really a game where it's hard to even say it, but I don't think I can. I think I can say it without being accused of any sort of bias or slanted mentality. That it really never looked like Kansas City had a major chance in that game. Uh, that obviously early on, it's always anybody's game early enough in the game, but Kansas City really never took the momentum out of Philadelphia's hands. Whenever Philadelphia had pulled it closer to them, Kansas City never really drew it back. I think that the closest that they probably came was early in the third quarter when uh, they finally got a little bit of closer in the margin, and you started thinking, okay, is this when Mahomes starts to turn it around? And then Philly promptly was able to make a couple of big plays offensively and defensively that snuffed out any really chance of any sort of Brady against Atlanta esque comeback that they may have had hopes to do. And to say nothing of the fact that Philly's defense, I can't say enough about what Philly's defense meant in this game. And the fact that they just put the hurt, no pun intended, put the hurt on Pat Mahomes so consistently and so significantly, where they literally drew Mahomes into perhaps the worst game of his career, if not certainly one of the worst games of his career. Just a really impressive thing to see. I can't say enough about what Coach Fangio has done for this team, for a team that had the worst defense or one of the worst defenses in the league just less than 2 years ago. So that was fantastic to see, and I hope both inside and outside of Philadelphia, this just completely snuffs out any question that anybody has still been asking about whether Hurts should be the quarterback, and especially whether Nick Sirianni should still be the head coach. I hope that those questions are over, because I had heard for so long Hurts can't win the big games, which I haven't understood, because Hurts went toe to toe with Mahomes a couple of years ago and lost to him by a field goal, and then just forget toe to toe, just stomped on him this year in the Super Bowl. I I don't think. Not only do I think you can't be dragging Hurts and cynical of Hurts at this point. I think that some of the guys that we've been told he's obviously better than, or he's obviously more, a better level of a quarterback than the Justin Herberts of the world. Even perhaps getting into conversations like Josh Allen, whatever you want to say about Josh Allen. Josh Allen has not beaten Mahomes in a playoff game, and Hurts has now done it in the biggest game and outplayed him in a loss in the biggest game. That wasn't, Hurts wasn't the reason that they lost that game. I'm not saying that you should consider Hurts the best quarterback in the NFL, but you dang sure should not be continuing to put him outside the top 10. I'll put it that way. But the one who I really think deserves, proved he deserves more respect is Coach Sirianni, because we heard for so long, he's too rah-rah, he's too much of a fiery coach, he lets the passion get to his head and one thing or another. I'm just going to read a couple things about where Sirianni stands now, not in terms of Philadelphia coaching, but in terms of NFL coaching, because I think that that's the only way empirically that I can get across what these last couple of games have meant. Excuse me. Sorry about that. There are only 27 coaches in NFL history who have won the conference more than once for the conference championship. And of those, there are only 22 who have reached and won the Super Bowl. Excuse me, the hiccups. And looking at the guys who have won the Super Bowl, look at those guys who have won the Super Bowl. We're talking about obviously the names like Belichick and Reed, who are still active, but talk about some of the all-time guys. We're talking about guys like Don Shula, talk about Tom Landry, talk about Chuck Noll, talk about Joe Gibbs. Now, a lot of those guys who did win more conference championships than did Sirianni didn't win the Super Bowl. We'll talk about your Bud Grant, your Marv Levy's, your Dan Reeves. Of these guys who have won the Super Bowl that many times and who won the conference championship at least once, because there are 5 guys who won the championship more than once but didn't win the Super Bowl. So of those 22 guys, 13 of these guys are Hall of Famers. The ones that aren't Hall of Famers, it's because many of them are still active. We're talking about your Kyle Shanahan's. We're talking about not Kyle Shanahan. He didn't win the Super Bowl. I'm sorry. I meant Mike Tomlin, Sean McVay, Andy Reid, those types of guys. And the only ones who are neither active nor in the Hall of Fame are guys who are universally considered to be very good coaches, which is your Mike Shanahan's, Mike Holmgren's, and guys like that. So numbers don't lie. Whatever people want to say, whatever Kurt wants to try and bait me into, numbers don't lie. You got 22 coaches who have won the Super Bowl multiple times and won at least one conference title. And won more than one conference title. You've got 13 of those guys who are in the Hall of Fame. And again, several of those guys who aren't in the Hall of Fame are active coaches. The fact that if anybody is still saying to me that Sirianni, one, is on the hot seat or is telling me that he was carried by his roster, this is one of the narratives in sports that I hate more than others, is because it's like you're almost like you're penalizing somebody twice. I understand if you want to give somebody more flowers because of, they overcame a bad offensive line, they overcame a bad defense, they overcame a questionable play at quarterback, they overcame injuries. I understand if you want to give somebody, a coach or a player, more flowers based on that, but then don't double down and also penalize somebody for having a good roster, for having a good quarterback, because there's a good chance that person that you're dragging for that had something to do with that player or coaches or whatever, or part of their team has something to do with their success to begin with. I don't think Sirianni, should be penalized for having a talented roster when, for all we know, part of the reason why the roster is as talented as it is because of him. Like, I really don't like this narrative. Again, I'm all for giving it to a guy like Burrow a few years ago when he overcomes a shoddy offensive line, but I'm also not gonna give him that and then take it away from somebody else that their offensive line is good, because again, depending on who they are and what their role is on the team, they might be part of the reason why their offensive line is good. So I'm willing to give a grace for someone who's overcome something, but I'm not going to also do a double tax and then come around and penalize somebody else because theirs happened to be good. Like to me, that's almost a form of, and I don't know why we do this so much, but we almost like penalize greatness. I'm all for having higher standards for someone and higher expectations for someone than somebody else, but I'm also not going to go. I think it's fair to do that in to one level. I think you're going to another level if you start penalizing them for that, and I think that that's pretty unfair because I don't know of many quarterbacks who can win with everything going wrong around them, and I mean literally everything. Like I think that every quarterback needs something to go right for them, and I don't think that's a negative thing to say. I don't think it's an unfair thing to say. It just means that you can't win games independently, like on your own, fully on your own for a long period of time, that's sports. So I don't like this narrative that we're going to penalize success or we're going to hold the success of somebody's team against them. To me, that gets counterintuitive and hard for me to wrap my arms around. But suffice it to say, it's no longer a question in my head. I was asked earlier in the season, do I think Sirianni should get an extension? I said, I'll wait to see how the season plays out. That's conversation's over. Sirianni is the coach of the Eagles. Sirianni should be the coach of the Eagles for many years to come, and he should be having Jalen Hurts right there with him. I don't know what's going to happen in offensive coordinator. That's obviously a question that has to be figured out now with the Saints poaching Kellen Moore, which is obviously the cost of success. But I tip my cap to Jeff Lurie. I tip my cap to Howie Roseman. Howie Roseman, in my opinion, has gotten himself from off of a hot seat 4 years ago to now somebody who I think deserves votes for Canton. It's very rare to see an executive win 2 Super Bowls, go to a third, and have the rosters be vastly different in terms of having done so. So, it's in my opinion, and again, I'm 24 years old, so people are going to say, "Oh, you're not old enough to say that." My opinion, especially from what I know about football history that happened before I was born and such, in my opinion, we just saw one of the great Super Bowl dominations that there's been. Like I said, the 18-point margin doesn't do the justice of how close this game wasn't. This game was really always Philadelphia's to lose, and they never made the mistake that would cost that let Kansas City get the momentum back. And when they did make that mistake, they turned around and they squashed out any hopes that Kansas City realistically had of gaining any of that momentum back. It reminded me of, if you go back a few years into quote unquote history. I know this wasn't that long ago, but if you go back to Super Bowl 40, I want to say it was either 48 or 49. But it's whenever that Super Bowl was, that's the Seattle Seahawks completely dominated the Denver Broncos. It was 43-8, and it was that physicality. It was that incredible defense that they had, the Legion of Boom, as they called it. It was up against an all-time talent at quarterback with Peyton Manning. It was a game that that really Denver was never able to regain the any sort of dying breath of gasp of air for being able to potentially come back on Seattle. And again, Seattle's style of play, where yes, they had a very good quarterback, but it was also a lot of that physicality. It was a lot of that defensive punch you in the mouth, then death by 1,000 cuts, and then also just the moxie and just the body language. I've been focusing on this a lot more as I've gotten older, is the body language of the teams, both during and before big games. And I just never thought that Kansas City went in. I'm not going to say they looked apathetic, but Kansas City never really looked to me like they were coming in with the mentality that no matter what happened, they were going to do whatever it took to win the game. And Philly looked like they had that mentality. I mean, for having that, for crying out loud, going after the game, we looked and we saw Jalen Hurts give interviews. He had this look on his face like he was still in the middle of the Super Bowl, still trying to win it. Like, he didn't even look like he'd already won the Super Bowl yet. He looked like he was still in, bulldog mode, going out there and, kill the opponent type of mentality. And I have a lot of respect for him. I was grateful he did make a couple of poor throws and a couple of not great decisions, but Thankfully, when he did, his teammates bailed him out, and he also, in turn, he also was able to put the team on his back a couple of times when they needed him to go out there and do something big. But again, I'm not going to spend the whole time talking about this, but again, I just can't say enough about him and what he accomplished, and looking forward to seeing what happens going forward with the Eagles and what happens this offseason. Obviously, there's a lot of work that has to be done. Thankfully, one situation that they're in now that they weren't in a few years ago when they won in 2018 is they're not, aside from their offensive coordinator and a couple of players, they're not standing to have to do a huge overhaul this offseason. They're in position to keep a lot of the core that helped them win this year. They are standing to lose Josh Sweat to free agency, although there's talk that they're going to try and bring him back. However, if they either decide not to, or if they want to try and still upgrade at that position, I know that they have interest in Browns defensive end Myles Garrett. I know that they're interested in talking to Cleveland about him. I know that on the linebacker side, Zach Bond, who was one of their big breakout players this year, one of the big breakout players in the whole NFL this year, I know that he wants to come back to Philly, and I know that they have have every interest in bringing him back. So I will not be surprised if a deal gets done there. I wouldn't be surprised if it happened before free agency, but we'll see how that transpires. But even if he gets to free agency, I think Philly has a good chance to bring him back. But then you look at the players who were part of the core of the starters this Super Bowl. A few years ago in Super Bowl, the 2018 Super Bowl, a lot of these guys, you had guys who were like in their 30s, who were in their late 20s. These were guys who were all either expiring contracts or on one-year deals, or just getting into the more advanced ages. In fact, only, if I remember correctly, I think it was only 12 of the 22 starters. No, I'm sorry. I think it was only 5 of the 22 starters back in 2018 who were age 27 or younger. And this year, it's more than double that. More than half of those guys that Philly had on the Super Bowl starting lineups on offense and defense, more than half of those are now 27 or younger. And I think one had just turned 27 who wasn't included in that 12. So this is a team, and I've already heard people like Stephen A. Smith. Y'all know I'm a big Stephen A. Smith fan. I've already heard people like him start to say, this is not a team that we know was just catching lightning in a bottle. Obviously, it's hard to repeat in the NFL. I mean, we've seen that for a long, long time now. But anybody who thinks that Philadelphia, was all in on this year, I mean, they obviously were all in on winning this year. But anybody who thinks that they were not looking to the future as well and looking to only win one Super Bowl, I'm not so sure about that. I think that Philly believes that obviously you have to upgrade the roster still. Every year you have to make changes. Every year you have to make upgrades. Every year you have to make adjustments. But anybody who thinks that Philly is not going to go in with the mentality that they can be one of those teams that challenges for a repeat, I think that they have every belief that they have the ability to do that, and I think they should have every belief they have the ability to do that. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about before I switch off and start talking about some other things is one of my favorite sort of bylines or storylines or I guess footnotes, however you want to phrase it, from this game that I think it got some attention, but I think it should have gotten more attention, is just the hilarity of the ultimate outcome of the Carson Wentz saga from a few years ago. Because for those who don't remember, when Carson Wentz was their quarterback, then they had won the 2018 season. Then he had played the next year or two, but didn't play quite as well as he played in his MVP season. And then in 2020, that last year that Coach Peterson was there, just everything, the wheels fell off on everything, including Wentz. Stuff started to come out about how he was kind of not the best leader in the locker room, one thing or another. And then about halfway through that season, which they ended up going 4-11-1 in that season. That was one of the last seasons when they only played 16 in regular season games. These reports started to come out about the locker room, and then eventually Carson Wentz pretty much just said, because he had gotten benched, and he pretty much just said, I want to get traded. So as the offseason unfolded, they ultimately agreed to a trade with the Colts, and they got back 2 draft picks. Because of those draft picks and the trades that they, and excuse me, because of those draft picks and the trades that they made possible, I'm going to pull this up real quick because I don't want to get it wrong. But the amount of guys that they had on this team that came just from winning, or that came just from that trade made possible getting Devontae Smith, AJ Brown, Jalen Carter, Jordan Davis. That trade made possible getting like 7 starters that were on this team. That also was, excuse me, it just, and obviously it wasn't just those picks. It was what those picks helped get them by how they use those picks later on. Some of those involved trading them again. Some of those involved the players drafted there. Sometimes, but those 4 pieces were only in the immediate aftermath. It doesn't tell the what happened with those trades when some of those picks that they got in those trades later on got flipped again. But ultimately, suffice it to say that 4 major players and several other role players became possible solely because of that Carson Wentz trade. And I don't know if anybody saw it, but Carson Wentz was sitting on the bench for Kansas City as the backup quarterback that entire game. So it was a great feeling for a lot of Philadelphia fans who, I get that some people still love Carson Wentz. I get that, and I respect that. But the fact that people were so upset about the Carson Wentz trade, but upset at Philly, not upset at Wentz, but were upset at Philly. And then they turn around a few years later. Not only do they win a Super Bowl before Wentz does, but they win a Super Bowl against the team that Wentz is backing up with a starting lineup that's half built off of players that they wouldn't have gotten if they hadn't traded them. So what I love about football is just the way that these storylines can go. I do think, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I do think if Philly's able to make another run in the next couple of years with some of these guys, I'm not going to be surprised if you start talking about this trade the way you've been talking in the past about some like the Herschel Walker type deals. Obviously, there's a long way to go for that because that led to multiple Super Bowl wins. But I'm just saying, I do think that that's not unrealistic. Mr. Osborne says, hey there, Scoops, might be an interesting free agent season for a lot of teams. Yeah, very much agree. I do think that what Saquon did this year in particular, I think that he helped make it, helped re-emphasize the importance of having not just a running game, but a good running back. Because I think a lot of people, very much self-included, I'm not gonna pretend like I wasn't one of these people, but I think I think it was thought for a little while that running backs were sort of interchangeable and sort of replaceable, which I think a lot of them are, but some of them aren't. And you saw that Saquon was one of those exceptions. There are still some guys who set themselves apart and who are not replaceable at positions like running back. And Wentz has proved. Barkley has proven himself to be one of them. So I do think, depending on who's available this offseason, I think you might see teams look a little bit differently. If a star running back becomes available, they might look at him and say, well, he is getting older. He has been a little bit injury prone, but based on his talent and what we just saw Philadelphia being able to do with Saquon, it's a risk that we're willing to take more so than maybe we would have been a year ago. So I do think that'll change. I think that and we've known that they're important, but I think that they're also going to shed more light and cause teams to prioritize like the entirety of the offensive line. I know that tackles and ends have been important, but I think that the interiors, the centers, the guards, the nose tackles, I think those might get a renewed sense of appreciation this offseason because, again, it's what happens in the trenches so much that helped Philly get to where they are. But that was the entirety of the offensive line. It wasn't just Lane Johnson. It wasn't just Jordan Mailata, although they were 2 of easily the most important players on the team. But it was also guys on defense and some of that depth. It was not just Josh Sweat. It was your Milton Williams, of the world. It was your Jalen Carters, who we were told he was a run stopper and he couldn't protect the pass. All these things. So I do think that you're setting up for like you said, a very interesting offseason. And I think it's also going to be interesting to see if the way that this team performed and what led them to success in different areas at different times. I do think that'll make it interesting to see if some of these players who maybe were in a period of time where we thought maybe they were getting a little bit undervalued, which was kind of an overcorrection to people who thought that they were overvalued. I do wonder if we start to see some of that balance out this offseason. I think that the interest and the intrigue of the offseason, obviously you've always got the draft, but it's a couple of years ago, or a couple of times in the last 2 years, we've had it because there's so many quarterbacks that people love. This year, there's really not many quarterbacks that people love. Some people love one or two quarterbacks, if that, and some people don't love any of them. And then this is also one where, a lot of years you hear teams or teams say that there's a surefire number one pick in this draft. Now, in my opinion, I'm still doing research, so this is not a heavily well-informed opinion as of yet. But from what I do know, I'm kind of surprised that people aren't looking at Travis Hunter as the surefire number one player. But again, I'm still learning a lot about some of the other guys. But the fact that Tennessee apparently is very open and very interested in potentially trading number one, that tells me that there isn't really a guy that they love, or at least they feel like there's a guy another team will love enough to make it worth trading out of that, rather than Tennessee just selecting that guy themselves. So we'll see what happens there. But I agree, and I'm looking forward to seeing what your guys do. But obviously now that's about a month away, and now we shift into baseball mode with spring training upon us, which I'm excited about. I've been waiting for spring training, obviously, since the end of Game 5 of the World Series. So hopefully this team is able to come back. It's been talked about a lot about how a lot of people think that to pivot now over to spring training, it's been talked a lot about how people think the Yankees need, one more bat. They think that even though they made a lot of good moves this offseason, a lot of people think they still are not in lockstep with not only the Dodgers, but even teams like Atlanta and, the Mets, who took Juan Soto, which, again, never let it be said that I kind of tried to delegitimize or devalue Juan Soto just because the Yankees lost him. That is not the case. He is the same very talented player. He's the same legendary hitting, batting eye ability that Ted Williams-esque type of discipline and whatnot. He's that same guy that he was when he was on the Yankees. So I'm in no way going to turn around and say, "Oh, he's a scrub now that he lost, or now that we lost him." What I am going to say though is I do think there were paths where you could get better as a team on the whole, or as they say in one of my favorite movies, Moneyball. In the aggregate, they got better, even having lost that one player. And I do think that argument can be made here. And I think that if you were going to lose Soto, I think having an offseason where you bring in Cody Bellinger, Devin Williams, Max Fried. I know we brought in Goldschmidt. I'm less confident that that's going to – I'm not saying that was a bad move by any stretch, but I'm less confident that that's going to be a huge difference maker than I am on some of the other names. And I don't think that they're done. I think you're going to see more moves get made. I don't think you should sleep on the Fernando Cruz acquisition that they made from Cincinnati when they traded Jose Trevino. I think that there is a lot of I think there's a solid possibility that this team plays better together as a unit than they did last year. I don't know what the locker room was like last year, but I do know that guys like Verdugo and Stroman and excuse me, I know that guys like Verdugo and Stroman, among others, were not always viewed as the greatest guys in terms of teammate character, clubhouse chemistry, whatever you want to say. So I am curious to see how that plays out. Excuse me, similar was said about guys like Gleyber Torres. So I am curious to see how that plays out both on and off the field. But I think that they made some very necessary improvements to defense. I think that I said a few months ago when someone asked me on this show, I was asked, who do you think is the biggest and going to be the most impactful acquisition of anybody made this offseason? I think there's a solid argument for Devin Williams because obviously the back end of that bullpen, if you don't have top notch at the back end of that bullpen, you're limited in where you can go as a playoff team. But I do think that there's a strong argument for him. But for me, it's still Cody Bellinger, not just because of what Bellinger brings, but because of what he allows Boone to do in that lineup and in the field now. Because now you've got somebody who plays left center and first base, which is extremely rare in its own right. But now that allows you to be versatile in what you do with guys like not only Jason Dominguez, but guys like Oswaldo Cabrera, guys like Everson Pereira. A good number of different players on your roster. You can now potentially move around because of that. Mr. Dutchy says, "Have a great show, Scoops." I want to thank you, Mr. Dutchy. I hope you are doing well. Hope excuse me. Hope you and Michelle are doing well. And then Mr. Osborne says, "Hey there, Dutchy." We got a guy coming in from, it looks like, Kick saying, "Yo, what's up?" Eddie, nice to see you. Hope you're doing well. Excuse me. I do think that as long as we're talking about that, I do want to bring up the fact that a lot of Yankees fans have been looking at the fact that they haven't brought in a third baseman, and they're like, are we just going to go with Cabrera at third? Are we just going to go back to DJ at third? Like, what's the deal there? But they're not too thrilled about the lack of action there. I do think it's important to say, I think we looked at third base in too much of a vacuum in terms of where New York could improve. I think that we looked at them and thought, well, it's obvious that their hole is at third base. They got to go get a third baseman. But you can put not only a Cabrera or a DJ, you can put a guy like Peraza there. You can put a guy, or you can put Chisholm there, and at second base, you can put a guy like Peraza. You can put DJ LeMahieu back there when I always liked him better as a second baseman to begin with, at least to start the season. If you want to, buy some time in order to play out the. Now, is that what do I want to see? I don't want to see LeMahieu anywhere freaking near the starting lineup, but I think that people have baked in that third base was the area you have to, where you have to make that improvement, and I don't think that's the case. I think that they've got guys that they can put at third base and open up a hole at some other place where they could put in somebody else. If they have a guy that they like more at another position, they can make the improvement there and then shift one of their existing guys over to third. So I think that's been forgotten a little bit. I think guys like not only Cabrera, who I hope they keep as a utility guy. I don't want to lock him into one position. But I think that for guys like Pereira, guys like Peraza, I think some of these names have gotten forgotten a little bit or overlooked a little bit. When I think it's very possible that we see one or more of those guys. The plan apparently at second base was when and if they lost Torres was one of their young players, Caleb Durbin, before he got traded. So I wouldn't be surprised if they still see that as not only a possibility, but their reality at this point. So everybody who's pounding the table for a third baseman, I don't necessarily think that I don't think that New York is done upgrading the roster, but I don't necessarily think that upgrade has to come at third base like some people are saying. Coming off of that, that's really the last that I have to say about New York going into spring training. Couple of updates that we've gotten today, interview-wise, for those positions that are still not filled in the NFL. One of the positions that's not filled in the NFL is the Eagles' coordinator position. But I've heard surprisingly little about that in the days since the Super Bowl. I mean, I didn't expect anything about it the first couple of days because obviously they had just won the Super Bowl. But it's been a week now, so I'm a little more surprised that we've heard nothing at all. The most that we've heard really is a couple of speculative articles that And I'm seeing a lot of the same names brought up in those articles. I'm seeing Kevin Patullo, who kind of has been thought of as the in-house favorite. He's been the right-hand man to Sirianni for a couple years. He's been the, I think his title was passing game coordinator. There's been a couple of other names that have kept coming up. There's been Josh McCown, who was a former quarterback for them, who has been thought of as a future OC, at least, if not head coach, for the last couple of years now. There's been Marcus Brady, who was over in Los Angeles with Nick Sirianni on the offensive staff over there before they got the house cleaned out a little bit the last couple of years. And then a couple of other names that I've heard. I did from one person here the name Lincoln Riley. I don't particularly buy into that. But yes, so Brady, Patullo, and McCown have been some of the names that I've heard multiple times. But it's become pretty clear to me, at least right now, that this appears to be a sort of wider search. Another name that I've heard has been T. Martin, the position coach over in Baltimore, who's worked a lot with Lamar Jackson the last couple of years. Another guy has been former Eagles offensive coordinator the last time they won the Super Bowl, who then ended up becoming sort of a mentor to Nick Sirianni in Indianapolis, which was Frank Reich. So I've heard those kind of are the five names: Reich, Martin, Brady, Patullo, and McCown. Those kind of have been the five names I think that I've heard the most. There was some talk about a guy like Darrell Bevell, who's a former offensive coach and interim head coach. There's been a little bit of talk about David Girardi. But those five names that I gave you a few moments ago, I think those are really the five names to look at right now, at least in terms of the names that have the most buzz connected to the Eagles at this point. I would say, if I had to guess, the slight bit of edge that I would give in terms of just who I've heard most consistently attached to the job is Patullo, but that might just be because they hadn't gone into outside interviews yet, which they have to do. So I think that while I would consider him the quote unquote favorite right now, if I had to guess, just based on what I've heard, I think that that's very subject to change once interviews start to kick off more. Carson Shear says, yo, congrats again to Carson. Thank you so much. I'm hoping that both of our teams bounce back and have a couple of great games against each other next year. I say it again, had your guys advanced further than Philly, I would have 100% been rooting for y'all the rest of the way. And I'm looking forward to seeing how they bounce back. I'm also I have watched a few of your Pistons games recently, and obviously I know that the season has not gone great, fantastically. I do know that I've gotten to watch a few games, and I've enjoyed, watching some of the games they've played. I think that they're on like a 5-game winning streak right now or something. So that's been nice to see them kind of righten the ship a little bit. Been nice to see my guy Stewart out there when he hasn't been getting himself either injured or suspended. My guy, I think, like I said a couple weeks ago, I think that he forgets that he's not playing with Rodman and Lambeer in the 1980s and 90s, but hey, I can see why I've seen him called y'all's quote unquote emotional leader more than once. He definitely seems to have that bad boy Detroit basketball ethos and pathos, which is not surprising to me as somebody who had the pleasure to share a locker room with him for about half a season. Obviously, that was several years ago now, but I'm not surprised at all. I think that y'all did well to pick him up, and I'm glad to see that. Even when he was in rumors to potentially be traded, even though he was potentially in rumors to be traded to my Pelicans, I am glad that y'all have kept him and that y'all have really doubled down on keeping him and what he means not only on the court but off the court. Because I think he, when I think of what I know about him just from the experience of being in the locker room with him and what I know, obviously, which is only of so much, but what I know so much as an outsider looking about Detroit basketball. I think that that's a very solid match chemistry-wise. So that doesn't surprise me at all. That seems to be a great fit for him. There's a lot of that passion. There's a lot of that physicality. There's a lot of that intensity. There's a lot of that, which I think it's cool to say now. I think for a while, maybe people didn't think it was quote unquote cool to say this, even though I thought I did, even though I thought it was. But I think that there's a lot of that, we're going to knock it down when we're on our way up, we're going to bite a kneecap off. I think there's a lot of that in Isaiah Stewart. And I think that there's a lot of that just in Detroit sports at large. So I'm glad to see that that's that's resonating with Detroit sports beat writers. Excuse me. So going back to what I was saying with regard to the coordinator position, it is a little surprising to me that we've heard nothing on that front. There was a brief moment where they didn't. I think the Saints didn't finalize Coach Moore's hiring as head coach until I think it was Wednesday. So there was like a brief moment in time where Philly fans were kind of deluding ourselves into, oh, is he gonna kind of double back? Is he gonna take his name out and stay with us and run it back with us? I don't know if you saw, there was an interview where Coach Sirianni was something, I forget if this is exactly what he said, but he basically said let's run this shit back, Kellen, or something like that. Which I loved hearing him say that. I can't say enough about the fan of Sirianni that I am. I mean, obviously that was before the Super Bowl, but definitely very much now afterward. He's been talked about potentially getting an extension this offseason, which I now 100% believe he deserves. I was leaning that way for several months, but if there was ever a way to solidify that, it was winning the Super Bowl, and it was punching Reed and Mahomes in the mouth doing so, which they were able to do. So, and what I love about that as well is, so Philly has now won 2 Super Bowls, both of which were in my lifetime, but both of which also maybe not ended, but definitely disrupted what people thought was a dynasty, because their win in Super Bowl 52 would have, if they had lost that game, it would have meant a three-peat for New England, and had they lost this game, it would have been a three-peat for Kansas City. So a lot of the NFL who was not wanting three-peats for a team, a lot of the NFL owes it to Philadelphia, because they've been the only team that stopped 2 three-peats in the last decade. So another just storyline I love there as well. And as long as we're talking about coaching contracts, it has made headlines the last couple of days that, yes, the Yankees are expecting to offer and get done an extension with Aaron Boone this next several months here, maybe as soon as before opening day. I don't understand why people are so surprised by this or so upset by this. Even if you're upset by it, I don't understand why you're surprised by it, because we've pretty much known this was going to happen since his option was picked up last year. But frankly, I don't understand why a lot of people are upset about it either. Excuse me, because you ask anybody connected to the team, and when I say connected to the team, I don't mean like works for the Yankees. I'm talking like people who are in independent media who cover the Yankees, whose job it is to go in there and be critical and one thing or another. People like Joel Sherman, who are one of the most willing to be critical writers of the Yankees that I know, which is one of the reasons why I love them. They've gone in there and interviewed, and then there's been other guys like Bob Klapisch and I can't remember who the other ones were that I'm thinking of right now, but guys who have gone in there and interviewed people, not just in the Yankees but around the game, and said fans don't understand the respect that these people have within the game, the actual game of baseball, and the baseball industry, and why they have that. Which, again, I'm not going to sit here and defend people on the Yankees for the last 15 minutes of the show, but I'm going to say there are legitimate reasons as to why they are in line for these extensions. I know people are going to look at it and say, oh, it's just because they do whatever the higher ups want them to do. And I'm just like, 1, no. And 2, that's way too much of a one-dimensional way of looking at it. And 3, if they were doing everything opposite of the way that the team wanted them to, or the front office wanted them to do, they wouldn't have a job. I mean, part of any job is doing what your higher ups is working within the some constraint of what your higher ups see as the vision. So I also, I mean, you were never going to see somebody who's employed by somebody else do everything opposite of what their employer wants them to do and keep them around. Like that doesn't happen in any business for a long period of time. I can't point to one business where that's the case, where someone's signing your checks and you're going out and doing the opposite of everything that they ask. So unless you're in, one episode of Seinfeld that happens to be my favorite episode of television ever. But at any rate, so I don't understand why there's still that rage, why there's still that ire toward that whole situation. Frankly, I think Boone's been a very good manager, at least much better than if you want to use kind of a quote unquote against the spread, for lack of a better word. If you want to talk about not just as a general, but in terms of the way that they're spoken of. What the? I apologize. There's a big storm going on outside right now, and I didn't realize it. So the lightning flash caught my attention. Anyway, but yes. So I'm not entirely surprised at all, really, by this. I am more surprised by the negative reaction that it's getting. It's not because I knew people didn't like it or didn't like Boone or Cashman or somebody at least in that chain, but because there's this negative reaction, but it feels like a negative reaction in a shock manner, which I don't understand where the shock is coming from, because again, Boone has not shown me any reasons to fire him, and I'll say it for the 8 millionth time: if I'm going to ouster you, it's got to be because one second. If I'm going to ouster you, it's got to be for a reason other than just he's either not emotional enough or too emotional or what they're. There's got to be some sort of tangible, real reason, and moreover, more importantly, I have to know what I'm doing as your replacement, or at least have a general idea of where I'm going as your replacement. Not necessarily know the exact guy, but I have to know the guys I'd be targeting. If you move off Boone, I don't know who you're targeting as a replacement. Everybody wants to say Don Mattingly, which, fine, but I've yet to hear really a substantial case for that. I feel like people just say Don Mattingly because it's like the first Yankee-connected name that they can think of who might fit the position. But I've mentioned in the past, I look at guys like David Ross. I look at guys like Gabe Kapler, but I don't have any reason to believe that those would be surefire upgrades on Boone, or that there's any real reason to believe they would be even 50-50 to be upgrades on Boone. I don't see it. If I had to pick, those would be probably my two guys to pick, but I don't see any reason to drastically believe, with even a 51% to 49% likelihood, that he'd be an upgrade, that they'd be upgrades. Because there's not like it's not like it's been several years ago when there just happened to be an all-time winning manager like a Bruce Bochy flying around, or a Bob Melvin flying around. Which, if you remember, they tried to interview Bob Melvin several years ago, and were rebuffed in a way that San Francisco later wasn't. Or not San Francisco. It was either San Francisco. No, San Diego wasn't, because he went to San Diego and then went to San Francisco, because it was that whole weird thing. But in any event, like there isn't that sort of Bill Belichick-esque manager out there where that New York would be champing at the bit to at least give him an interview if he became available. There just isn't that right now. Even Girardi was considered that back in, I think it was like 2006 when he was manager of the year for the Marlins, but ended up getting fired anyway. I think that's what it was. And around there, when Torre was on the way out, some people looked at him as it's got to be Joe. It's got to be Joe. There isn't that right now. And hang on one second. I'm sorry. Guys, I apologize. I'm going to have to end the show a little bit early. I apologize. I'll see you guys next week. I'm sorry for doing this abruptly, but I will see you soon. Same scoop time, same scoop channel, and I'll be fine. I apologize for doing this abruptly. I have unexpectedly got to log off. I apologize, but I'll see you next week. Same scoop time, same scoop